prepared. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, people will ask, well, where has this fella come from and why is he writing about labour history? I spent my life working in the public service, and I joined the Eastern Health Board as a young clerical officer in 1974, and I retired early after almost 36 years service from the HSE, and it allowed me the opportunity to pursue a very personal interest in history, and it also allowed me the opportunity to embark on a third level education. And I think for many of my generation in the early 70s, it was an opportunity that was not available to many of us, and I felt, well, the system isn't going to defeat me, now is my opportunity. I'll do it, and I'll study my love of history. And that kind of study continued longer than I expected. I completed a Master's in History in St Patrick's College in Drumcondra in 2014, and it was on the subject of farm labourers in North County Dublin and the 1913 lockout. I was living in North County Dublin for most of my life, and I was fascinated, having read Pádraig Gates's fascinating account of the Dublin lockout, and I, like maybe some others, thought the lockout was a city-based event, and reading Pádraig Gates's account, I was drawn into the impact of the lockout in County Dublin, particularly farm labourers in North County Dublin, and I was familiar with some of the place names, town names of farmers that were mentioned. So it became a subject for my MA thesis. I then graduated to pursue a PhD in history, and I think labour history was also always going to be under consideration, and I studied history at a PhD level in DCU, which I completed in 2019. And this book, Workers, Politics, Labour Relations and Independent Ireland, 1922 to 1946, was born out of that thesis. And the book is essentially divided into two parts: 1922 to 1932, initially under provisional government, then Covenant Ale administration, and then under Fianna Fáil from 1932 to 1946. So one might ask, well, why does it finish in 1946? Fianna Fáil were still in office, but it had to end somewhere, and I thought the introduction of the Industrial Relations Act of 1946 and the establishment of the Labour Court would be a good bookend, particularly for a subject on labour relations, and that's where it ends. So this presentation is based on the first part of the book, from 1922 or from 1922 to 1932, and it looks kind of at a number of events which engaged labour relations at the time, and the relation, how kind of both government and trade unions engaged with those events, and how government and labour engaged with each other. So I'm not a regular public speaker, so bear with me and forgive any deep breaths. Prior to the let me move on here. Prior to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, independence had been portrayed as a panacea for resolving all manner of political and social problems, and as a foundation for economic stability and greater equality. However, initial euphoria quickly gave way to inevitable disappointment. The new state was born in the most unfavourable circumstances. The economic slump after the First World War had set in motion a pattern of bitter labour conflict and unrest during the formative years of independent Ireland. trade unions fought to resist forced wage reductions by government and employers, not only to protect the standard of living of their members, but also to safeguard their own survival. Employers, trade unions and government were ill-equipped to deal with emerging labour disputes and work-based issues. For many, the construct of labour relations was vague, meaningless, and not afforded much consideration. Labour relations structures were not sufficiently developed or robust enough to assist in labour relations in the resolution of labour conflict, which had both the capacity to destabilise the government and to threaten the survival of the trade union movement. This presentation considers some of the factors, including Civil War strikes, the construction of the Shannon scheme and unemployment, that impacted the development of labour relations within the first decade of political independence in Ireland, and how both government and the labour movement responded to those developments. The first national system of legislative-based labour relations was created in Britain and Ireland by the enactment of the Trade Union Act in 1891 and the Trade Disputes Act in 1906. The legal background to labour relations in both Ireland and Britain followed identical patterns until 1922, and although the Free State Constitution of 1922 made provision for the continuation of applicable British legislation, it did not make any significant contribution to labour law and labour relations. Labour relations practices and machinery remained rudimentary when the Free State was established, reflecting perhaps the insignificant nature of the new state's industrialised economy. State intervention was kept to a minimum. The adoption of the 1922 Constitution clearly indicated that the government had rejected calls for the inclusion of economic and social issues on the basis, according to the new President of the Executive Council, W.T. Cosgrave, that the principle of economic sovereignty was unnecessary window dressing, while the Minister for Home Affairs, Kevin O'Higgins, declared that it would be unwise to embody in the Constitution anything which might resemble communistic doctrine. During the early 1920s, trade union expectations and government objectives were utterly incompatible. The former resisted wage cuts, while the latter facilitated them. Both actors viewed one another with suspicion and antagonism, and it soon became clear to the working class that political independence did not necessarily mean social and economic independence. Wage boards served as a quasi-labour relations mechanism. They facilitated agreement on wage levels, helped resolve disputes, and in some locations dealt with unskilled workers such as farm labourers. The Royal Commission on Labour, which had sat from 1891 to 1894, and which had inquired into labour relations, employer and employee combinations, and conditions of labour, formed the conclusion that many of the difficulties between employer and worker could not be remedied by any legislation. And they identified the absence of what they described as an intimate relation between the employer and the workman as the main reason for many workplace conflicts. On the 10th of January 1922, just days after the ratification of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the new president of the Provisional Government, Arthur Griffith, and his ministers met a delegation from the Irish Labour Party and Trade Union Congress. This was led by Thomas Johnson, leader of the Labour Party in the Dáil and effectively leader of the opposition. He was also secretary of the Irish Trade Union Congress, and consequently one of the most influential figures in the labour movement. The 10th of January meeting was significant because it was the first Labour deputation received by a native government. The problem of unemployment dominated discussions. The Congress delegation subsequently reported that Griffith, quote, demonstrated courtesy, understanding and a readiness to act, and accepted that the workers of Ireland have taken their full share in the fight for Irish freedom. End of quote. Expectations were duly raised. However, the challenges facing the new administration were immense, and social and economic issues did not command a high priority. The growing unemployment problem was the subject of significant discussion at the 1922 Congress, with Johnson describing it as the most important problem facing the country. The protracted discussions on the Anglo-Irish Treaty had absorbed all political attention, and Johnson endeavoured to keep socio-economic issues before both government and Congress. In March, he sought government action on a range of social issues, including unemployment, housing, and the breaking up of large ranches. The tone and nature of Griffith's response indicated both the burden of his responsibilities and his awareness of the extent and the range of issues of grave social and national importance which demanded government attention. He undertook to address them all at the earliest possible moment. However, referring to the looming shadow of civil war and the forthcoming general election in June, he added that work on these issues was dependent on, quote, the people's decision, whether there shall be war or peace, anarchy or stability, confusion or destruction. In most cases, there was no regular contact between employers and unions in the workplace during the 1920s. Pay bargaining arrangements were not formalised, and there was no agreed procedure for conducting negotiations. Pay negotiations were localised, and the Irish Trade Union Congress took no role in the process. If collective bargaining failed to produce a settlement to a dispute, both sides could avail of informal and non-binding ad hoc conciliation and arbitration services. The settlement and the method by which it was reached were the responsibility of the parties to the dispute. However, the government did have powers to intervene in major disputes which might cause significant public inconvenience, and in such cases a court of inquiry, the nearest approach to compulsory arbitration, was established. Responsibility for labour laws rested with the Department of Industry and Commerce following the abolition of the Ministry of Labour in September 1922. Its abolition signalled that the development of labour relations practices and procedures was low on the list of government priorities, and it went against the advice of Henry Clay, a British expert on labour relations during the 1920s, who maintained that a specialist department was essential for a successful government policy on labour relations and wage disputes. The abolition of the Ministry of Labour was indicative not only of the government's attitude and lack of interest in labour issues and labour relations, but also to the absence of any understanding of the importance of labour relations. It represented, according to the historian Joe Lee, the institutionalised neglect of labour. Its abolition attracted little attention or criticism, and bizarrely, the Labour Party welcomed its abolition. The Labour Party TD and the dominant figure in the ITGWU, William O'Brien, opposed a separate Labour ministry because it replicated, in his view, the English model. And this was a spurious argument given the degree to which the Irish Trade Union Congress was modelled on its British equivalent. By 1922, rising unemployment depressed consumer demand, which sent the economy spiralling into long-term recession. During this period of deflation, employers sought to reduce wages to remain competitive. Workers fought to retain their earnings, and in the unstable political conditions, industrial action was occasionally violent. A raft of disputes across a range of local authority services, industry and the agricultural sector in particular, led to strikes and lockouts in late 1922 and early 1923, mainly among ITGWU members. Almost 800,000 working days were lost due to strikes and lockouts in 1922, rising to just over 1.2 million in 1923, before falling back to a little over 231,000 in 1925. The causes were reduced wages, working conditions and sympathetic strikes. An agricultural wages board, which had been established in September 1917 to determine minimum pay and conditions, was abolished in October 1921. Upon its abolition, the chairman noted that despite some shortcomings, the board had assisted in stabilising labour relations within the agricultural sector. He acknowledged the good spirit of the working relationship between employer and employee representatives on the board and hoped that this tolerant atmosphere would continue. This did not transpire. While the trade union movement lamented the abolition of the Agricultural Wages Board, it was welcomed by many of the county farmers' associations. Clashes between both sides were inevitable. It was obvious that a dangerous vacuum had been created by the abolition of the board. Agriculture continued to be the mainstay of the Irish economy in the 1920s, and the government clung to the belief that the interests of the farmer and the nation were identical. Convinced that national prosperity depended on agricultural exports rather than a programme of industrialisation, the government believed that the best way of reducing farmers' costs and maximising their incomes was through reducing farm labourers' wages, which fell by more than 20% during the decade 1922 to 1923. The post-war slump shifted the balance of power decisively in favour of farmers. Cuts to the wages of urban workers soon followed. The focus of the trade union strategy was to retain wages at existing levels if possible, or to keep wage reductions to a minimum. In the changed economic circumstances and with the elimination of the statutory minimum wage, responsibility was placed on the trade union movement to maintain wage rates by securing voluntary agreements with employers. And although farm labourers, as noted by Emmet O'Connor, swelled the ranks of the trade union movement following the First World War, bringing with them a new sense of activism and radicalisation, many ITGWU organisers were concerned by what they described as, quote, a lack of the sense of solidarity and generous comradeship, end of quote, among farm labourers. Farm labourers were viewed by some activists as having no loyalty to either the trade union movement or the Labour Party, and contended that as soon as the conditions of those workers improved, they became bitter opponents of labour. Whether their circumstances improved or not, the loyalty of farm labourers to trade unionism was fickle. During his address to the 1922 annual Congress, Thomas Johnson advised delegates that the labour movement had entered discussions with the government from a position of strength due to its support for the national struggle. Johnson warned that if a positive response was not forthcoming in relation to social reform, including the problem of unemployment, the people would rise and sweep them away. This was more an attempt to rouse his audience than any serious challenge to the government, and it was probably born out of a euphoria created by the extraordinary response by workers to the labour movement's anti-militarism strike on the 24th of April 1922, and to the significant success for Labour at the June 1922 general election. However, the substantial participation of workers in the strike may have been wrongly interpreted as an indication of trade union strength and support, as the demonstration was not confined to the ranks of organised labour. All classes took part in it. Two major labour disputes, the 1922 postal strike, and the 1922-23 farm labourers' strike in County Waterford occurred during the Irish Civil War. And they are significant because they were the first major labour disputes in the new Irish state, but from a labour relations perspective they are revealing for several reasons. Cosgrave's government adopted a civil war mindset when approaching social and labour relations issues that was maintained throughout the 1920s. Consequently, any form of unrest, even if unrelated to the treaty's settlement, could conveniently be deemed a threat to state security. And with unlimited discretionary powers, the government responded to social and labour unrest in a heavy-handed manner that would have been unacceptable during peacetime. In the case of the postal dispute, the government's decision arbitrarily to withdraw the right to strike from postal workers not only damaged relationships between the government and the labour movement, but presented an ominous outlook for the future of labour relations in the new state. The Nationalist and Leinster Times newspaper described the government as, quote, determined to use all possible power, forces, propaganda and means to deny postal workers their claim to a living wage and their rights to carry into operation their functions as trade unionists. In the Dáil, the Labour Party TD and trade unionist Cathal O'Shannon decried, quote, the scrapping of every principle of individual liberty by the government. Tom Johnson viewed the government's interference with the right to strike as an infringement of human rights and of far greater importance than the pay issues at the heart of the postal dispute. The legal rights of civil servants to withhold their labour were subsequently curtailed by provisions within the Treasonable and Seditious Offences Act 1925 and the Department of Finance Circular 14 of 1927, thus forcing civil service unions to eliminate the strike clause from their constitutions. As was the case during the postal dispute, the government became increasingly concerned that if labour unrest among farm labourers went unchecked, its authority would be undermined and its electoral base among larger farmers would be imperilled. The government was predisposed to support farmers in their dispute with labourers in County Waterford and to deploy military force to protect trade and property. This was even more pertinent in a dispute not only about wages, but one in which the concept of property ownership was being challenged. The military support provided by the government to landowners during the farm labourers' strike in County Waterford occasioned the collapse of the strike, a substantial reduction in the wages of agricultural workers across the entire country, and the alienation of agricultural workers from trade union organisation. The events in County Waterford and elsewhere clearly demonstrates what life in the Free State would be for farm labourers. And while not specific to County Waterford, material in the Irish Military Archives demonstrates how the Minister for Agriculture at the time, Patrick Hogan, colluded with farmers' associations by lobbying for the internment of local labour activists as IRA irregulars, despite the lack of any evidence. Notwithstanding the formidable challenges facing an inexperienced government, fearful for the survival of the state, its response to the postal and the farm labourers' disputes was belligerent, and this hostility mirrored its view of anti-treaty Republicans. The government's disdain for one was as strong as its contempt for the other, and in the aftermath of the Civil War, striking postal workers were as much casualties of political victimisation and vindictiveness as Republicans. Government reaction to both strikes reveals its naivety in labour affairs. The overreaction to labour unrest was essentially a reflection of the government's political insecurity, which demanded a need to demonstrate control. Apart from Michael Collins, whose input was minimal due to his assassination in August 1922, no government minister demonstrated even a rudimentary grasp of the norms of labour relations. Even in the first months of the new state's existence, the disputes demonstrate the release of deep social class tensions that had been held in check during the previous decade by a shared sense of nationalist mission. The nature of the government's response was a clear indication that the establishment of the Irish Free State did not herald a new beginning for Irish labour. Both disputes also proved a formative experience for the government, because for the next decade the government viewed labour relations and labour unrest only through the prism of the Civil War. A disregard for labour relations and an intolerance of labour unrest and ambivalence towards workers' conditions and the plight of the unemployed became the order of the day. This was particularly evident during the labour troubles on the Shannon scheme. The development of the Shannon hydroelectric scheme at Ardnacrusha in County Clare in the mid-1920s was an audacious project for an infant state recovering from civil war, and it attracted considerable national and international interest. The scheme aimed to provide a national network of generating stations, producing power for urban consumption initially, and then to be followed by a rural electrification programme. While the political and socio-economic history of the scheme has received historical attention, the experience of workers who endured some of the most gruelling labour conditions during the interwar period largely has not. The Fair Wages Clause was at the heart of the Shannon scheme dispute, and its abuse and manipulation by the government further undermined the already tattered nature of labour relations. Following concerted labour representations, a Fair Wages Clause was adopted by the government's Contracts Committee in January 1923. Essentially, this obliged contractors for government work to pay wages, quote, not less favourable than those commonly recognised by employers in the trade in the district where the work is carried out. In November 1926, W.T. Cosgrave and his government, in an extraordinary move, approved a motion which effectively altered the terms of the Fair Wages Clause so as to ensure that unskilled workers employed on the Shannon scheme were paid no more than the rate paid to a farm labourer in the surrounding counties. This was disingenuous, for not only were farm labourers in the surrounding counties paid less than a living wage, there was no comparison between the work of a labourer on the Shannon scheme and that of a West of Ireland farm labourer, described by Tom Johnson as about the poorest in Europe. Labour feared that the wages offered to unskilled workers on the scheme, 32 shillings per week, would become the norm for similar national projects in the future. From a labour relations perspective, the Shannon scheme dispute had a deeply unsavoury aspect to it. The dispute was not just about a fair and a just wage. It also revealed much about class, social justice, unemployment, government prestige and its contempt for labour relations. The government's attitude towards workers and working conditions associated with the scheme was coloured by its experience of labour unrest during the Civil War. It denied any responsibility for working conditions on the scheme, refused to negotiate, manipulated labour agreements, and continued to disregard labour relations. And while promoting the Shannon scheme as a magnificent showcase for the infant state, the opportunity to utilise it as a template for improving employment conditions, even moderately, and establishing sound labour relations practices to facilitate future industrial development was not so much as spurned as never contemplated. The dispute gravely damaged the trade union movement's trust in the government, and it left a legacy of cynicism and bitterness. But it also demonstrated the weakness of the trade union movement, the faults in its organisation, its poor sense of strategy and coherent planning, and its overestimation of support among its own members. While the government basked in the warm afterglow of the project's successful completion, no long-term benefits accrued to the trade union movement or workers. Trade union failures associated with the Shannon scheme prompted a reappraisal of Labour's mission, and it set in train a push for change, albeit at a slow and an uneven pace. Rampant unemployment essentially defeated the Labour movement's campaign for fair wages. And this is a key factor in understanding the labour issues associated with the Shannon scheme. The hunger for work turned Ardna Crusha, described by one writer as Ireland's Klondike, into a mecca for unemployed men. Unsurprisingly, there was little confidence in the government's interest or its ability to address the unemployment problem. Unemployment was the dominant social problem during the 1920s. Throughout the 1920s, unemployment commanded considerable attention in the press, in the Dáil and from the Labour movement. But there was little agreement on how best to alleviate it. Unemployment brought with it human distress and deprivation, and it nurtured a significant level of discontent which had the potential to intensify the political instability which marked the early years of the Irish Free State. One might have expected unemployment to have been harnessed by the Labour Party to boost its political appeal. In fact, it became the party's Achilles heel. For the government, unemployment was constantly overshadowed by security and financial priorities. For Fianna Fáil, following its establishment in 1926, it proved an issue around which it could mould its policy and eventually gain office. Despite rapidly increasing unemployment, the Irish government was unable to determine the number of unemployed persons, either insured or uninsured. As Tom Johnson observed during a Dáil debate in October 1924, quote, "We do not know with accuracy how many unemployed persons there are," end of quote. In March 1925, the Department of Industry and Commerce suspended the publication of weekly unemployment figures until some better system could be established. Consequently, an accurate measurement of unemployment during the 1920s is extremely problematic, and unemployment statistics, as Cormac O'Grawdon notes, are notoriously difficult to interpret. And this remained the position until at least 1932. During the 1920s, official unemployment figures only represented the numbers attending employment exchanges to obtain benefit or to seek employment. The figures did not reflect the actual number of unemployed persons, as many did not qualify for benefit under the restrictive Unemployment Insurance Acts, and therefore did not register as being unemployed. In addition, unemployment was high among agricultural workers, and as they were not insurable, they did not register, and so also were excluded from the official unemployment figures. Official figures were therefore limited in scope. In 1922, the figure suggested that approximately 8.9% of the total wage-earning population was registered as unemployed, but this is grossly understated because the figures were totally inaccurate. Despite the lack of proper statistics, the demand for work and the plight of the unemployed was apparent to all. But yet the government mischievously misused grossly understated unemployment data to boast of unreal economic achievements. The Labour movement conveniently became a target for the government to deflect blame. The Cumming Ale administration wasted few opportunities to accuse Labour of exasperating the unemployment situation, and in a thinly veiled attack on the Labour Party and the trade union movement, Cosgrave was highly critical of the raft of labour disputes which had occurred since the formation of the state, and suggested that the labour movement's lack of control over trade disputes and its demands for higher wages had contributed to both the country's economic woes and the unemployment problem. However, Labour's appeal for cross-party accountability and their declaration that the problem of unemployment not ought to be the business of one particular party literally fell on deaf ears. Unemployment was also causing Congress some concerns. It had essentially sapped the strength of individual trade unions, had weakened the movement's capacity to bargain with employers, and it also eroded working class solidarity. For William O'Brien, the General Secretary of the ITGWU, unemployment went to the foundation of all their problems. The ITGWU annual report for 1924 noted that all trade unions had suffered both in membership and finance through unemployment. Some delegates at the 1924 Congress doubted the purpose and effectiveness of campaigning on behalf of the unemployed due to the weakness of trade unionism at that time and the fact that it was unable to command the support of the mass of workers. That the Cumming Ale government did not engage with unemployment in a meaningful way was a product of its financial stringency and values, both of which had been shaped by the Civil War. The government's approach to unemployment was encapsulated in a 1923 report by Joseph Brennan, the Secretary of the Department of Finance. He opposed a policy of state subsidies or grants to relieve unemployment, stating, quote, "The economic evil of unemployment is generally less hurtful to the state than the evil of inflationary finance." End of quote. Excuse me. However, in November 1927, a committee on the relief of unemployment was established under the chairmanship of Vincent Rice, Cumming Ale TD for Dublin South. Its membership consisted of a broad range of representatives drawn from industry, the labour movement, local authorities and government departments. Its task was to identify steps to relieve unemployment. The work of the committee was, however, doomed from the outset by the limitations under which it was expected to operate. Cosgrave insisted that the government had no money at its disposal to support any recommendations which the committee might make. One might ask, why did he agree to set it up in the first place? In addition, the committee was, according to Fianna Fáil's Sean Lamass, quote, "blindfolded and gagged and bound hand and foot and hamstrung," end of quote, by its terms of reference. The committee's final report was met with a stony reception by the government and effectively buried in a typical Cumming Ale response to an unwelcome report. At the very least, it reflected a total disregard for the unemployed. The government deliberately misrepresented flawed unemployment data, which tended to minimise the true scale of the unemployment problem and disguise its inability to address this social ill. Its refusal to acknowledge the extent and the social impact of unemployment may have been driven by a fear that the problem had the capacity to damage government attempts to present itself as a strong, capable and stable administration. The government largely abdicated its social and moral responsibility, and the book was passed to the voluntary charity sector. Where charitable assistance proved insufficient, emigration was an option taken by many. Eventually, the labour movement emphasised financial support rather than work to ameliorate conditions for the unemployed. And this underlined the brutal economic reality that job creation, at least in the short term, was unlikely and that public relief schemes were degrading and ineffective. And it was also significant in that it represented a demand for the reordering of the relationship between the state and society. In conclusion, during the 1920s, the government made no effort to advance the development of labour relations and supporting structures. Notwithstanding the formidable challenges facing an inexperienced government concerned for the survival of the state, its response to the postal and farm labourers' dispute was belligerent. Not only were workers' rights threatened, but in the case of postal workers, those rights were actually withdrawn. Both strikes also depict a government intent on forcing the subordination of workers at all cost. That the Civil War strikes effectively set the tone for the government's subsequent attitude to labour unrest was evident during the labour dispute on the Shannon scheme between 1925 and 1927. The dispute demonstrated the absence of the most basic features of labour relations, such as consultation, negotiation and respect. The Shannon scheme was an opportunity to set a national standard for basic labour relations norms. However, the government's Civil War mentality remained so embedded and intractable that such a possibility was far removed from its considerations. This dispute also witnessed the government's cynical abuse of the Fair Wages Clause, which had been originally conceived to protect low-paid and vulnerable workers against unscrupulous employers. The Shannon scheme demonstrates how little importance the government attached to labour relations, employment conditions and the general welfare of the unskilled working class, even when the dangers of civil war had passed. Disinterest and inflexibility also marked Cumming-Ailes' approach to unemployment, the dominant social problem of the time and a neglected subject in Irish historiography. Its tactic of deflecting problems and delaying decisions was exemplified in its response to the unemployment problem during the 1920s. The government's conscious use of erroneous unemployment data and its reluctance to accept responsibility for the effects of unemployment represented not only contempt for labour relations, but a dereliction of its social responsibilities. Not only did little change much for workers post-independence, conditions for many disadvantaged groups actually deteriorated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gerard, for that very, very informative walk through what was obviously a pretty miserable time in Irish society. And we can maybe touch on the reasons for it. You just mentioned at the start of it the Agricultural Wages Board. In my time as a union official, a member of our executive got the last job as the last Agricultural Wages Board inspector in the late 1980s, and after about a year in the job I bumped into him and I said, "How are you getting on?" And he said, "The job is great, but I'm poisoned with tea." Because every time there was a complaint made that a farmer was underpaying a farm labourer, he had to go and he'd go into the farmer's house and the first thing was a cup of tea and some scones were put up in front of him. So anyway, it was abolished after he retired.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because like in 1917, I said I think it was kind of abolished, but it was resurrected in the early 1930s. So it was really abolished at a very difficult time and an important time for farm labourers, you know, who were struggling with kind of forced wage reductions and other social problems. But as you mentioned, Shay, that it was resurrected, I think, again in the 1930s.
Yeah. No, I suppose ultimately what it showed was, the view of the government was that the farmers were the backbone of the country and the state, and farm labourers had no stake in the country. Listen, I'll open it up to the audience here, so any questions or comments? Donal,
Thanks, and thank you very much, Gerard. Well, you can sit down for obviously a very important and scholarly contribution which you've made, and I congratulate you on that. I had a couple of short questions, I hope, for you that came to mind as you were talking. First of all, I'm thinking that in the early 20s, the same government was also anxious to promote its international recognition and profile, and became a member of the International Labour Organization in Geneva, which of course was the first and oldest, it still is the oldest international organization since the First World War. The hypocrisy of it all, really, because in 1924 there was the mass demobilization of an army that consisted of over 100,000 men, I believe, at the time. And my grandfather was one of those demobilized in 1924, even though he was a veteran of 1916, which added insult to injury. So I presume the demobilisation also added to the huge unemployment situation in Ireland, and I welcome your comments on that. The second question is a little bit beyond what you said this morning, but your book does go to 1946, and I hope you'll do a second volume, 47 to 73 or something like that. But I was just wondering, given the anniversaries that we're all seeing, what was the situation in Ireland from during the Second World War, in terms of labour relations, and did the Second World War impinge at all on labour relations in Ireland?
Well, first of all, just in relation to your question on demobilisation, yeah, certainly it contributed considerably to the whole unemployment problem, even though arrangements had been made by the government to give serious consideration to the employment of demobilised soldiers on government work, etc. But an interesting account I came across through some of the archives at the time, and I think I mentioned it in the book, I can't remember what archives, but it talked about the significant amount of demobilised soldiers living roughly in the Phoenix Park because they couldn't get work and they had nowhere to go. And it sort of resonates kind of what we're experiencing now in 2024, that we had many men who were living in harsh conditions, who had done their work and served their time, and just had no work available to them. Just on the second question, like in the book, on the second part of the book, I don't wish to kind of promote any particular political heroes. That's not my kind of objective. But I do think that Sean Lemass, when Fianna Fáil came into power, did make a significant contribution to the welfare of the unemployed, and the first step would have been the introduction of the Unemployment Assistance Act in 1932-1933. And one of the benefits there was a number of benefits. People who couldn't avail of any sort of financial support before this had it for the first time. But another point was that it helped to identify the number of unemployed people, because now that most people could gain some form of financial maintenance, they went to register. So I'll come back to kind of just another point in a moment, but just kind of dwelling on this, the unknown quantity of unemployment in the 1920s, the government figures in the early 1920s were roughly about, say, 40,000, and then it dropped in about mid-1925 to about 25,000. And Cosgrave saw this as a magnificent kind of achievement of their economic policies. But my own belief is that what happened is that people ran out of benefit after a short period of time. They stopped going to the unemployment exchanges, so they didn't register. They were still unemployed, and many others were emigrating. And the trade union movement, from its own information, regularly believed kind of towards the end of the 1920s that unemployment was at least 80,000, if not 100,000, and a little bit more. And within months of the Unemployment Assistance Act coming into operation, the number of people registered as unemployed had well exceeded 100,000, you know. But just going back to Lamass, so that was one kind of area that he was working on, and he was working slowly and surely kind of on the development of industrial growth and the introduction of state agencies, etc. And you know, obviously that was brought to a halt by the Second World War and the emergency, as we call it, and quite a number of people went to Great Britain to avail of employment at that time. So in one sense, kind of it kind of addressed kind of the pressure here. But I don't know if that fully addresses them. But yeah.
Anybody else from the audience with a question or comment?
Just on the issue of William O'Brien supporting the abolition of the Ministry of Labour, what do you think was the reason for that? It seems bizarre.
Yeah, it's a good question, and again, I'm trying to think kind of where I came across that. It was in a Dáil debate, and there was a on the abolition of the Ministry of Labour. O'Brien was a Labour TD at the time in the early 1920s, and the question of the abolition of the Ministry for Labour came up, but people were talking about whether it should continue or whether it should kind of be abolished. And it was just a contribution from O'Brien, who threw out the remark that he didn't agree with it because we're only creating kind of an English model. Now, whether he intended to elaborate further as to what sort of a model he would prefer, I don't know. But the point I make as well is that, like, the Irish Trade Union Organisation, the Irish Trade Union Congress, its structures was very much similar to the British Trade Union Congress, yes, kind of at the time. But you are right, it's a bizarre comment, but I don't think he got the opportunity to expand on what he had in mind at the time. But the Ministry for Labour was later kind of reintroduced.
Mm-hmm. Charles?
Just to add a point in respect of the Unemployed Assistance Act of 1934. That was one of the 5 conditions that Labour extracted for supporting the election of De Valera in 1932. That act and the other industrial relations one related to the introduction of conciliation and arbitration, and they reneged on that.
Yeah. And
it's to be seen in the speech of William Norton when he seconded the proposal of the appointment of De Valera as Taoiseach.
Yeah, well, you know, I think we all know that come the 1932 general election, Fianna Fáil had robbed kind of any of the Labour Party policies, and I did mention when I was talking about unemployment there, that the Labour Party had eventually come to the conclusion that these unemployed men needed financial assistance rather than looking for kind of, you know, work that didn't produce kind of any great benefit or degrading work on schemes. So the actual introduction of a financial benefit scheme was first thought of the Labour Party in the late 1920s, and it was hit upon by Jean Lamasse. And for one, again, it's only a personal opinion, I'm not too sure if Jean Lamasse if he wasn't a politician or involved in Fianna Fáil at that time, would we have seen kind of any advancement on social and labour issues whatsoever, because there didn't seem to be a similar type of interest or contribution coming from other Fianna Fáil politicians.
Absolutely, and obviously the history of the time was the struggles between Lamasse and people who were totally opposed to his policy, Sean McEntee and people like that. Bill.
To what degree was that weakness based on intellectual incoherence? You did have people like Johnson and Cahill Shannon who actually knew what they were about. But looking through the newspapers and things at the time, and the contributions made by people on the Labour side, they didn't seem to know, they didn't markedly differ from a lot of people who would be in the governing party, or indeed the party that was to be the governing party. And the other thing, Chris, which you had touched upon, is the Labour organisation itself would have been pretty shaky. It might have been a model based on the British model, but it wouldn't have had the organisational strength.
I mean, that's true. The big advantage for the Labour Party at the time is that it was such a minority in opposition, so it didn't really have political clout. But certainly, as I mentioned it's quite apparent that throughout the 1920s, both in Congress, in the Dáil, and in the media, Thomas Johnson became a true champion for the unemployed, and it's something that he was constantly trying to force the government's hand, but it's just that their small representation in the Dáil didn't allow them to do enough, and then the extent of unemployment also didn't allow them to promote a whole sense of fair wages, and that's exemplified in the Shannon scheme when Johnson and his Labour colleagues looked at the despicable way in which workers were being treated, but they couldn't do anything about it because unemployed men were clamouring. Again, you had unemployed men camping around the area of Ardnacrusha with no guarantee of work, but in the hope of work. They had brought their wives and their families with them. They were living in farmyards. They were living to the extent that the medical officers at the time were concerned about sanitation and the spread of infectious diseases. And again, you could see similarities to what's going on in our present age. It's so strange. But Johnson's whole struggle and crusade for the unemployed was really defeated by the extent of it, and the fact that he, as leader of the Labour Party, was leading a very small group of committed politicians at the time. So it was a struggle really for them to make any particular progress on socio-economic issues.
And of course, the other thing is the fragmentation of the trade union movement. We'll be talking next week about the fact that there was two big general unions, the Transport Union and the Workers' Union of Ireland. You had the Amalgamated Transport Union as well. You had countless craft unions.
Yeah.
So the perspective of a lot of trade unions was...
Yeah. Just on that issue, could I just say that that whole issue of the struggle between the general unions, the return of Larkin and the establishment of of the Workers' Union of Ireland. And again, kind of the whole issue between Irish unions and British trade unions during the 1930s becomes an important problem as well, but it is covered in a particular chapter in the book as well.
Okay, anyone else? Maria?
Just on that note, Gerard, I haven't read the book yet, unfortunately, but have you mentioned or looked at in any detail partition as a distinct feature of the fragile state and its impact on the way things panned out in terms of, I suppose, the lack of any standards or structures for labour relations? Or did it?
So you mentioned partition?
Yeah, did you
Yeah.
consider it in your book in terms of, did you look at it in terms of how it
It's not,
impacted?
to be quite honest, no. I mean, I took the book really from the point of the kind of Anglo-Irish agreement and the Civil War. It essentially starts kind of with the Civil War strikes and where the new Irish government were going in leading in the whole area of labour relations. But in certain areas of the book, when looking at strikes and disputes and socio-economic progress, I look at examples in Britain and in other European countries. And I also, in the case of the Shannon scheme dispute, look at parallels with the general strike in Britain in 1926 and what was happening there. And for their own reasons and their own purposes, there was that struggle between government and trade unionism as well.
Yeah, and indeed, just given that you mentioned the miners' strike in 1926, the 1920s was a period of retreat in working conditions for all workers, and most of the disputes were about how large the pay cut would be rather than what advance would be cured. And sometimes we kind of treat, let's say, the Cumann na Gael government as uniquely evil on that front, but the truth of the matter was it was happening right across the Western world, because the wage rates of the First World War were being unwound over, usually in a pretty violent way.
I think it's strange as well, but when you're looking at labour history and trade unionism in Ireland in the 1920s and looking at Cumann na Gael, I was always conscious kind of in researching the book and looking at the book, is this coming across as an anti-Cumann na Gael? But we're looking at it from a trade union labour perspective. If we were to look at it from state security and financial accountability, it might be something else. But it was interesting, and one of the reasons why I forgot my notes this morning, being out for a walk earlier on, something came to mind about a letter that W.T. Cosgrave had written to Austin Stack prior to the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1921. And he was talking about these unemployed, he was talking about people from workhouses, but in general he was talking about workhouses, unemployed, corner boys. We would be better off without them. They make no real contribution to society, and the sooner they emigrate, the better. So you're kind of saying, well, is a lot of your personal attitude then develop into kind of your political approach at the end of the day? But that just gave one insight into maybe Cosgrave's thinking.
Okay, I have three people shown their hands, so I'll take the three maybe, and then we'll allow Gerard to kind of address the three of them. Starting Peter.
Yeah, a couple of things. The one thing that wasn't unwound was something that was extracted in 1919, and that was the HRT. And that remains throughout the 20s and 30s, although wages do fall. I read the book, Gerard, and I really enjoyed it. And it shows the disconnect between Cumann na Gael and labour market institutions of the state. There is, however, one exception, and it's not noticed because it's buried in the railway archives. And that was the establishment of the Irish Railway Wages Board in 1924. but internally there's a comment, because they're allocating who sits on the board from the employer side, and somebody says it has to be one of the Belfast Railways because most of the work in establishing this board was done by the Northern Government. So the first labour market institution of the state was actually a cross-border institution promoted by the Northern Government. But again, I enjoyed the book, and it was very illuminating on the 20s and 30s, and thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, final two questions.
Yeah, but as much an observation as a question, do you think the fact that probably our brightest and our best had left because of emigration, that the labour movement probably was weaker?
Well, just a personal view, I think that is always the case. You know, I always think that people who are prepared to emigrate have high aspirations for a better quality of life and the desire to make a contribution. And, you know, I suppose if you look back over the centuries, kind of we see that where many people from this country have made significant contributions. And we have people nowadays who are not emigrating due to economic factors, but because of the skills and the training that they have, there's a better opportunity to expand and develop those further kind of abroad. And we would like to think that they would now come back and make that contribution. But yeah, I think we did, and it's one thing annoys me. Just I'm going on a different tangent now, but I think of young people living in deprived areas who don't get sufficient opportunities, and due to natural talent and cleverness, that's missed out on. It's not tapped into. So I do think yes, we did lose out on a lot of people having to emigrate.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed the book, and I think there's a real value in exposing the ideological background of Common Ale. I don't think there's anything wrong with an historian doing that. It's interesting, I think, as well, that the government person who led on the government side against the post office workers was J.J. Walsh, who ultimately ended up in a micro-fascist party during the Second World War.
Yeah,
and behind him, as Minister for Finance, was Ernest Blythe, who also ended up in a micro-fascist party.
yeah, and like even before Walsh became Postmaster General, he was involved actively in trade unionism as such, you know. So
yeah, I've read some of his correspondence, and it's kind of hair-raising in terms of his attitude to workers and women as well.
Yeah.
He made a contribution during the campaign leading into the 1937 referendum, and along the lines of women have got far too many rights, we need to put them back in their boxes. So there have been a number of books published about the history of Common Ale leading into Fine Gael, and I think not glorifying Common Ale, but along the lines of they provided stability, they built the institutions, and I think it's important that the other side of the story is told as well, and I think your book makes a contribution to that.
Okay, well, I think that's, looking at my watch now, I think that's actually a nice way to conclude this morning's part of the session. I'd like to thank Gerard very, very much for enlightening us and enlivening the early part of our session today. I think it is truly important that the story of labour, trade unionism, workers' conditions in the Free State and thereafter is tracked, because and the opportunity is the tendency to look back 100 years, and now we can look back kind of post independence. I'd like to make a small presentation to Gerard. Hopefully this is a recent lovely publication of labour history and Irish history, and maybe we'll just conclude by a round of applause.